Hi everybody, welcome back to Geektube Central and our Game of Thrones Season 7 reviews. So we're now on episode 3, things are heating up. I have to say, because I know that it's only going to be 7 episodes, you're kind of like, well, there better be some decent length. I want more plot points. We do get that in this episode, but the way that it's carried on, you just can't wait for the next one because there's different plot points that are being set up and other ones that are kind of coming to an end. And speaking about ends, it's called the Queen's Justice, and in a way I think it mostly relates to Cersei's justice and the ending of not 1, not 2, but 3 characters we've come to get used to. Not all are loved though, but it is certainly Cersei's type of justice. So let's get this review going. So we start off in Dragonstone, where Jon Snow and Sir Davos Seaworth arrive with their small retinue of soldiers. Tyrion and Melisandre meet them and they take their weapons in their boat, and when it's first brought up you kind of get this sense where Jon's like, oh, see, maybe they were right telling me not to come here. But we break formalities and Tyrion calls him, the bastard of Winterfell, and Jon says, the dwarf of Casterly Rock, and they basically shoot the shit about how different it is and how he became the king in the north and how he became the hand of a Targaryen. It's all very interesting. But you can see that there's still this tension because the Dothraki being on the shore are quite unnerving, especially when they're without their weapons. But nonetheless, they walk up, and the shot here by the director is fantastic. It's really beautiful, and as they're walking up talking about their stories and how they should talk about how they got there, and Tyrion even brings up Sansa, which was quite funny, but then all of a sudden Drogon comes and he's low flying and everybody hits the deck, and you can see the shock on both Davos and Jon's face, but it's a sight to see. And Tyrion says, well, I'd like to say it was, you get used to it but you really don't. We then move up on the cliff's edge where you see Melisandre, and it's kind of like she has this longing. It's like she wants to be there with Jon and she's now focused on that, but she realises that she can't even go down to meet him, that they've fell out of favour with her. And Varys comes up and Varys actually questions why, and Melisandre says, well, you know, I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. Now we know what they are, but he doesn't. And they start to talk about how they're both foreigners and how they're different from the common folk, and she says she's leaving to go to Volantis, but that she'll be back because she's destined to die here on Westeros. And she even hints that Sir Varys is supposed to die too. And considering the Red Priestess powers, you can see how unnerved Varys is. So we come in and you see the hall, it's all clear, and you see Jon's face, and as he looks up and you see her on the throne, it is quite dark and she's surrounded by the Dothraki, and you're like, oh shit, this could be bad. And when they come in, this is probably one of my favourite parts, Melisandre speaks all the titles we know, basically all the Westerosi titles, Breaker of Chains, Mother of Dragons, the Unburnt. So basically it goes on and on and on. And when Jon turns to look at his hand to see what he's going to say, oh, this is just Jon Snow. He's king in the north. We then get into this kind of standoff on basically how she's the queen and how she's the rightful queen and how he's the king in the north. She states out straight flat out, well, you bend the knee, and if you do, I'll make you warden in the north. But he obviously isn't going to do that because the northerners are very distrustful of the south and it's all up in the air, and he's the king. And they start to talk about how Daenerys shouldn't be held accountable for her father's action, and that's all very true. Just like Jon shouldn't be held to his ancestors' oath to bend the knee to the Targaryen, right? Jon states straight out that the reason that he's there is because of the White Walkers, and there's a moment like, they're not really concentrating on that, but when she, in this picture, the way she's looking right now, she starts to talk about how she was bought and sold, used as a broodmare, she was raped and she was defiled, and you're like, oh, for God's sake, is she talking about her first time at Khal Drogo, and it makes you think that she's looking back at things in a different light, but she's basically building up our journey and how horrible it was, and how she couldn't look to gods, old gods or new, she had to have faith in herself, and how she's destined to rule Westeros, and she's going to be sitting on that Iron Throne, and you can see the conviction in her. And Jon just simply replies, well, you'll be ruling over a graveyard if we don't get rid of the White Walkers and the Night King. It's then that Tyrion speaks up and says, well, we're already fighting a war with my sister, and we've not got time to basically divide our focus. So then it comes down to what Sir Davos says in this next speech, and it is so bloody good. It's one of my favourite parts of the episode. He basically says, for all the things that brought you back to Westeros, that's the kind of thing that happened to Jon. That's what made him king in the north. He brought together the wildlings and the Northmen. He was the Lord Commander. He had all these hard sons of bitches behind him. Even though he was a bastard, he has no birthright. And he's fought for people to try and save people, and he even took a knife in the chest. He almost died, and that's when Jon cuts him off. Because they're not exactly believing the whole Night King and the White Walkers thing. I think they're not ready to hear that Jon was resurrected, because it's kind of like a one-upmanship as far as Daenerys is concerned. She's the last Targaryen, that she's got this mission in her mind and that she's been through so much, but if she knew about Jon, what we know about Jon, I think even she might start to doubt herself. And Sir Davos quite rightly says, if we all don't put our enmities aside, it doesn't matter whose skeleton sits on the Iron Throne, because it'll all be for nothing. And Jon pipes in after Tyrion says, well, it won't be that hard for you to bend the knee, because if you do, we'll get rid of Cersei and then we'll all take care of this issue in the north. But Jon says, people in the north put their trust in me, and I have to do what's best for my own people, because at the end of the day, you're just a woman whose only claim to the Seven Kingdoms is her father's name, the same Mad King that my father, Ned Stark, had to overthrow. And he has to basically stick to his own people, just like what she said after all the shit she's been through, and she does fling in this whole thing about how he's an open rebellion. But everything's cut short when Varys comes in and speaks to Daenerys, something we don't get to hear, but we all know that it's because of the clusterfuck that happened with Euron. At this point, we see Tyrion coming to see Jon on the cliff, and at this point you can see that Tyrion is actually willing to believe about the White Walkers, because you've got the dragons, it's not that far of a feat to think anything. But Tyrion tries to explain to Jon that Daenerys' followers are loyal because she's dedicated to protecting other people, and you can see that he sees that in Jon as well. So Tyrion's trying to find a bridge to bring them two together, and he says, if you have anything you need assistance of, maybe if you ask her for something, that might she can help you, and it would go a long way in talks about what they're going to do for the future. We then see Tyrion in the map room with Daenerys, and she's completely perplexed by this whole dragonglass thing, and he breaks it down that there's a lot of it here on Dragonstone. It can be used to fight mind and turned into weapons, and she's just still dismissive about this whole Night's King and White Walkers. But he says, I believe in Jon Snow, and you know what, I know we've just lost two allies, but we can gain another ally by helping him. And you can see that she's actually taken his advice, even though he comes up with that whole "a wise man once said" kind of thing, and you know that he's just basically making this shit up. We then move on to a scene where Jon comes down the steps and sees Daenerys is watching her dragons, and she mentions how they're named after her two brothers that are now gone. She notes that he lost his two brothers, and that she's obviously been thinking about what we all know, sometimes you have to question it, and she says, well, I'll let you mine as much of the dragon glass as you can, I'll provide as many men as you need. And Jon at that point tries to say, So do you believe me then about the Night King and the Night Walkers, the White Walkers, sorry? But she doesn't answer. She just quite regally says, you just need to get on with it now, Jon Snow. And as he walks away, she looks up at him as he walks away, and you're kind of like, oh my god, is this a frisson here? Please don't let this turn into an accidental incest scene coming up. Watch this space. Now this next scene is just to confirm that Theon Greyjoy is alive and that he's fished out of the drink, thankfully, by a loyal Greyjoy crew. Now, this is an important scene because you realise that when Varys told Daenerys that the Greyjoy ships have been destroyed, that they don't know if they're dead or captured, that the Sand Snakes and Ellaria could be dead or captured, we do know that he'll be able to get this information to Daenerys, but first he has to face up to the Greyjoy crew, like this man here, and they just can't understand how Theon is alive and Yara isn't here. Now at first they assume that she's dead, but when Theon says that no, she's alive, Euron has her, you can see that their belief in him just drops, because they don't understand why he wouldn't just have fought to save her and either get captured or die trying. And I really do think it isn't because he wanted to abandon his sister. He realised that he couldn't fight Euron, he couldn't save her, so the best thing to do was to run. And also he's kind of like PTSDing after the whole torture that he had underneath Ramsay, so I suppose in a good way it's good that Theon jumped the ship. We're now moving into some meaty territory here when we go to King's Landing, and we see a very triumphant Euron Greyjoy parading his captives, Ellaria Sand, Tyene Sand and Yara Greyjoy. Now the streets are filled with abusive people. He's got Yara by a chain round her neck, very symbolic, and you see she looks very defeated, but she's also got this angry edge to her, which I absolutely love. Now when he brings in his captives, he actually rides in on horseback. I'm sorry I don't have that as a picture, but it's pretty cool. And he comes in all proud and declares that he's a loyal subject to the Queen and that he's brought her gifts, i.e. Tyene Sand and her mother Ellaria, so that they can get justice for her murdered daughter. And Cersei begins to say how great he is as an ally. He's the greatest captain on the 14 seas, and he, along with Jaime Lannister commanding the armies, will get Westeros safe. And he also speaks to Cersei, and he's basically alluding, when am I going to get my prize, i.e. get married and everything. And she says, you know, you'll have what your heart desires when the war is won. Now you see in this picture, Euron's loving all this adoration, and he takes this moment to basically wind Jaime up and say, so how does she like it? You know, does she like it rough? Does she like it quite gross? And he mentions the whole finger up the bum thing, which I actually laughed at. We then cut to this scene in the dungeon, which is absolutely masterful. She basically says to Ellaria, you know, I can understand what you've done. I mean, we might be enemies, but I can understand why you've done what you've done, because you lost Oberyn and Oberyn's dead. But it was Oberyn's stupid own hubris that caused his death, and if he'd just not taunted Sir Gregor, he would be alive today. Instead, he's just bones, and Sir Gregor's stronger than ever. And then she starts to talk about how beautiful her daughter is, and, you know, I only had one daughter and you killed my only daughter. I know we're not supposed to have favourites, but I assume she is your favourite. And you can see the terror on Tyene's face, because Cersei starts to talk about how beautiful a Dornish girl she is, and I could imagine Sir Gregor crushing her head like a duck egg. But you can see that she doesn't want to do that. She says, I could do that, but I won't. And when she takes Tyene's gag off, for a minute you're thinking they're going to do something horrible to her, she's going to start screaming. Instead she kisses her, and the minute you kiss her you go, that's what those lip gloss is for. When she pulls back, Tyene just says mama, and the terror on her face. And that's when Cersei says, you know, I know how you killed Myrcella. It was with the long goodbye, and Qyburn says no, it's the long farewell. And she says, now you're gonna, is death certain? And he says yes. He says it could take hours, it could take days. She wipes off the gloss, well, the poison I should say, takes the antidote that Qyburns gave her, and you realise what she was talking about when she talked about Myrcella and how she didn't like the idea of Myrcella's face collapsing. She starts to talk about that with Ellaria. She says, you're going to stay here and watch your daughter die, and we're going to keep you alive, we'll force feed you if we have to, but you're going to watch her die and her face collapse in on herself. And you realise that is the wickedest way to die. And the way they're chained reminds me of the story of the Mad King who chained up Brandon Stark and his father, and he basically choked himself to death trying to rescue his father. Now there's obviously no rescue for Tyene and Ellaria, and sadly that's the end of that chapter with the Dornish. We're not going to see them again. And it's a shame because Ellaria Sand and Tyene Sand were the most interesting ones. We then cut to upstairs in the Red Keep, where Jaime, I'm not so sure if he knows about what happened in the dungeon, but he's relaxing with some wine. Cersei comes in and just goes straight to start kissing him. She goes down on him. It gets really not to 60. I think she's turned on by how she got her revenge and everything. And you finally see her asleep. Now I think the reason why we see her asleep is because she said earlier that she doesn't sleep anymore. I think she's finally feeling better and she's sleeping. She's there with her lover brother, and when the door goes she gets up, robes, opens the door to one of our ladies in waiting, and they've got the same style and the same short hair, and you can see her see Jaime in the bed, but she says nothing. She sends her away, and that's when you realise at this point Cersei doesn't give a fuck. But something's going to go wrong because she's already pledged herself to get married to Euron Greyjoy, but I think she's not going to keep to that. But watch this space, y'all. We then cut to Cersei meeting with Tyrion Astoris of the Iron Bank. Forgive my pronunciation. It starts off quite civilly. He mentions his condolence about Tommen's death, congratulates her on being a queen, and she's sitting there sipping wine. I'm pretty sure she's an alcoholic. But she basically says, cut the shit, you're here for your gold. And he says, yes I am, because you're in debt, a lot of debt. Even way back in Robert's reign there was a lot of debt owed to the Iron Bank, and they both know that when the Iron Bank gives gold, they use it as an investment, or as she calls it, a bet. Now she doesn't look like a safe bet, and she mentions how they might be considering Daenerys. But of course she's going to denigrate Daenerys as a possible investment, and she basically talks about how well she's doing in her war right now. But rather than ask for more gold, she's saying, I will pay you back in 2 weeks. Now the only reason why I think she would pick that shorter period is because she knows she's going to be able to do it. So watch this space. We then move north to Winterfell to see how Sansa's faring now that she's the temporary lady of Winterfell. You see a lot of movement, they're collecting grain, trying to sort armour out. She's taking counsel from Sir Royce and the new Maester, and obviously Littlefinger's there as well. It was really interesting seeing that she does command a presence, and when she's going down and she sees the armourers making new breastplates and everything, she's quite smart in saying, well, we need to make it insulated so that they're warm. How are they supposed to do what they have to do in armour if they're cold? And you see that they recognise in that, and they actually dutifully turn around and say, okay, let's do that. Now later Sansa's having a little talk with that slimy Littlefinger, and he goes on to say, well, you know, you need to fight every battle mentally, and thus if you've done that all in your mind, you'll always be prepared and you will never be caught short. But that's all cut to shit because she's given word to go to the gate, and there she sees Bran on the back of a wagon, and he just looks so, not robotic, but he just looks so unemotional. And Mira Reed, who looks like she's lost a lot of weight and she looks quite worn thin, Sansa just falls into his arm and hugs him. And the thing that I noticed is when you cut to this next picture, cut now, he just looks like he isn't there. He looks like his body might be there but his mind's away, and obviously we know why, because he's the three-eyed raven now. So cut to being in the Godswood, which is a beautiful scene because it reminds me of episode 1 where Ned Stark was sharpening ice by the gods, by the heart tree, with Catelyn coming over, and she's confused when he says that he's the three-eyed raven, and he starts to talk about what it means, and she just doesn't seem to understand it. So he looks up at her and he says how beautiful she is and how it was much like this that night, the way the snow was falling. And she's just listening to him, and you can see she's trying to think of what he means. And when he says, "You look so beautiful in your white dress," she's so freaking shocked by it. She gets up and she starts to walk away. And this is the bit that we saw. This picture here is a frame from what we saw in the series trailer before episode 1. And okay, that does mean that he has some sight, that he managed to see something that he couldn't possibly have known because he wasn't there. But picking that one memory, you can see that that's really shaken her, because she had this confidence after Ramsay died, because she really had to bury that stuff, and with Bran revealing that to her, I think that's too much to bear, and I have to admit that would creep me out. So in the end I was actually shouting at the screen, "Bran, of all the freaking memories you could have picked, you could have chose something much better than that." We then move south to Oldtown for much happier scenes, where Archmaester Ebrose is examining Ser Jorah. And we see that he's completely removed of the greyscale. There's some red marks and everything, but that'll fade. And even though Ser Jorah said, "Oh, I just went to bed and woke up, I'm fine. For some reason I'm just all better," we know that that's not how it happened, but the Archmaester releases him and says he can leave anytime he wants. And Sam does a beautiful gesture by clasping his hand and giving him a handshake. Now bear in mind, Ser Jorah hasn't been touched in a long time, and you can see how happy he is. And that's when Ser Jorah says, "Now that I'm healed, I'm going to go back and be by my Daenerys, my queen's side." And this picture is just a beautiful picture because it's hope for Ser Jorah. We then cut the shit. The Archmaester knows what Sam did. He could quite rightly expel him from the order for doing it, but at the same time it worked, so he's not really going to chastise you for doing something that did work. So he says, "Well, you've done great and everything, but I'm not going to give you a reward. You've still got to do the same shit you were doing before, but here's some old large manuscripts that are all covered in fungus and bugs, and you need to make copies of them, otherwise they'll just rot away." So in the end, even though he did a great thing, Sam, he still is getting a punishment. But considering how we've seen the Queen's justice, it's nice to know that Archmaester isn't quite so severe. We then return to Dragonstone, where we see a very pissed off Daenerys, because she wants to find Euron's fleet and sink it. Now, Varys and Tyrion say, "Well, we don't have enough ships to do that," and that's when they realise that Daenerys means, "No, I'll go by dragon." And obviously, she feels confident that if she has Drogon, Viserion and Rhaegal, she'll be fine, but that's when Melisandre and everybody says, "Well, yeah, they might be fine, but you'll be out in the open, and you don't know if all of his fleet's in one place, and you can end up getting hurt." Now, she's got that in her mind, but obviously Tyrion's like, "No, we need to get Casterly Rock," and this is where you see the Unsullied figurines with the Lannister lions, and that's when it comes into play, where you hear Tyrion voicing over this next scene. After 7 seasons and much talking about it, we're finally at Casterly Rock, and from this vantage point you see it as this formidable looking fortress on top of a giant rock. It's impregnable, using Tyrion's words. He says his father basically made Casterly Rock what it is today, and even though they're well armoured, and even though the Unsullied look like they'll rile over the top of them, it's a hard slog. If you try to go over the walls, it's very hard, you're more likely to die. But then you realise that Tyrion said his father did everything except do the sewers. He gave that job as a slight to Tyrion. And so he used it to sneak in whores at night. In this case, they use it to get the Unsullied to get inside the castle. Now, once inside, there's a lot of fighting and carnage. Yes, there's losses, but Grey Worm is successful. He gets up and you realise there's not that many Lannisters there, and when he looks over the walls from Castle Rock, you see that all the ships are burnt and Grey Worm is stuck. Now he has no way to get back, and you actually see the Silence, Euron's giant ship in the bay, and you're like, well, oh, this does not look good at all. We then move to Highgarden in the Reach, where we realise the reason why Castle Rock was so easily taken was because most of the Lannister army were marching on Highgarden with Jaime. Now, we don't see much fighting in this scene at all. It's mostly just the might of the Lannister army, and you see Jaime at the head with Bronn, Dickon and Randall Tarley, and you see from Lady Olenna's viewpoint that she's cornered. There's all this Lannister army coming and you just see the might of it, and you don't see any fighting, funnily enough. You see Jaime come and find Olenna sitting by herself, and she says, you know, did we fight well? And he says, well enough, because after all, she says, we're more golden roses. They're not really bred to be fighters. It's there they discuss what we've already seen, that Castle Rock was not really well defended, and even though the Unsullied took it, they let them take it, and now they're stranded without ships. And even though it's civil, he mentions that Cersei wanted to execute her, flay her, hang her body from the ramparts at the Red Keep, but in the end he persuaded her to do a much nicer thing, which was to give her poison that would be a lot quicker way to die. It's not going to be excruciating, and when he pours it in the glass, she gulps up, and she seems relieved because she's kind of closed circle. She knows where she is now, and at that moment she admits, you know, I remember when Joffrey, your son, died, clawing and scratching his throat, turning purple. It was an awful way to die, and it's not really what I expected, because I'd never seen anybody poisoned before. And that's when she admits that it was her. And you see the face on Jaime, and you keep thinking, he's tooled up. Is he going to stab her or what? And in the end, he doesn't. He just stands there while she says, tell Cersei it was me. I want her to know. And in the end, Jaime just turns and leaves, and the last scene we see is Lady Olenna sitting in her chair by herself. Now the death is off screen, but I suppose by having her alive at the end of credits, it's kind of like her victory, her last victory before she dies, because it's the dying part she was already willing to do because she'd lost everything that she cared about, and she's lived a long time, but that last little barb from the Queen of Thorns, that was a masterstroke, and I have to admit, it's so sad that we won't get to see Diana Rigg as Lady Olenna anymore, but damn, what a great way to go out. So wow, what an episode, huh? Episode 3. So, the Queen's Justice. Whether it's actually justice Cersei got, more likely it's really revenge, but that is her version of justice. There's the upstairs justice where she's taking them as prisoners, but down in the dungeon she's poisoning one and leaving the other one to watch her daughter rot. Now that all plays back to when Cersei was mourning Myrcella at the beginning of episode 1 last season, and how she just couldn't imagine that beautiful face collapsing and rotting in on itself. So she basically put Ellaria Sand through what she put Cersei through, and sometimes payback's a bitch. I think Ellaria Sand definitely deserved some punishment for what she did. Whether I would do what Cersei did, it's completely different, but in her mind she's got justice, and the fact that she brazenly had sex with Jaime afterwards and you actually see her sleeping, it's like she's fulfilled something she's wanted and she feels justified in it, and because she's the queen, no one's going to tell her no. So we have Cersei having her justice, and she's riding high. As she said earlier in the episode that she's drew first blood, and it looks like she's doing better. Now Daenerys, the other queen, she looks like she's in a bad place because she's lost the Dornish, she's lost the Tyrells, she's lost the Greyjoy fleet. Yara's captured. She's obviously not found out about Theon, but he's not much of a power player anyway. The fact that she's brought up the idea that she just wants to climb on top of Drogon and find Euron's fleet and burn it down, that's a knee-jerk reaction to the problem she's having, but I believe that the dragons are a powerful tool that she can use, and she will use it. Now let's talk about Jon Snow and Daenerys. That was definitely a highlight, seeing those two together. It seems like this last couple of seasons we're getting lots of reunions and a lot of character interactions, and it's all good. Now whether or not, now that Bran's back in the picture, that the information that Jon is a Targaryen will come to light, I don't think it will come to light anytime soon. But at least we have good news in that Ser Jorah is now free of grayscale, and he's made it plain that he's going to go to Daenerys, and he'll know where to go. He'll know she'll be on Dragonstone, and I think with him by her side, that will really bolster her confidence, because even though it looks kind of hopeless, the fact that the Tyrells, the Dornish, the Greyjoy fleet that she had are all out, and that our unsullied army are stranded in Castle Rock, it might not look good, but don't count her out. She's still got might of the dragons on her side. She's still got the Dothraki who haven't came out yet, and I can't wait to see Dothraki screamers with their araks just chopping heads off. You know that's going to happen. So moving into the second half of season 7, it looks like Cersei has Daenerys up against the ropes. It doesn't look good, but at this point she still hasn't used the Dothraki, like I just said. She hasn't used the dragons, but as much as Cersei has obviously benefited from taking Highgarden and getting rid of Lady Olenna, she's obviously going to be taking the riches and paying off the Iron Bank. But when it comes down to it, Daenerys' ancestor Aegon, he managed to conquer the Westeros with 3 dragons, and eventually Cersei's going to force Daenerys' hand, and Daenerys is going to come for her, and I think we're building up to something of that. Whether we're going to get to see it all this season, but final thoughts on the episode. I absolutely loved the Jon and Daenerys scenes. I really did enjoy the Cersei scenes, even though it was quite dark and disturbing. And seeing Lady Olenna bow out, it was bittersweet. But looking forward to having more Stark reunions. I'm pretty sure Arya's going to show up in the next episode, and I wonder how that's going to affect the dynamic. Having Daenerys, because both Bran and Arya have changed the most, and that dynamic, how is that going to fit in with Winterfell? Will Arya even want to stay at Winterfell, or would she want to go on to finish off her list? That's more questions than answers, but we will go into that in the next episode. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I know it's really long and I take forever to get the episodes out, but trust me, I put my heart and soul into it, and hopefully I'm going to get into a groove, and when the season ends I'm definitely going to do information videos on things that haven't really been discussed in detail on the show. But thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.